ASHRAE launches a Center of Excellence focused on indoor environmental quality. Carrier explores turning air conditioners into grid assets. A European report highlights the role of multi-level governance in climate action. Frascold marks 90 years in the HVACR sector. India's data center capacity grows fourfold. Mostra Convegno Expocomfort 2026 concludes in Milan. Saudi Arabia unveils a $100 billion AI initiative with massive cooling implications. And new research highlights the growing role of heat pumps and refrigerants in the global energy transition. This is Surendra Balakrishnan, and you are watching CCME On Air. And now, the news in detail. ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers, has announced a significant development in indoor environmental quality. The society has launched a Center of Excellence for Indoor Environmental Quality aimed at advancing understanding across air quality, thermal comfort, lighting, and acoustics. ASHRAE said the initiative aligns with its broader focus on designing buildings around human health and well-being. ASHRAE said the initiative also supports ongoing efforts to develop a unified framework for evaluating indoor environmental quality in buildings. Air conditioning may soon play a new role in energy systems. According to a Reuters report, Carrier is developing HVAC systems that can act as grid support assets. The concept involves integrating batteries into air conditioning units, allowing them to store electricity and release it during peak demand. With cooling accounting for nearly 10% of global electricity use, this could fundamentally reshape how buildings interact with power grids. At a policy level, climate action is increasingly shaped by multi-level governance. The recently released European Multi-Level Governance Story report has highlighted how coordination between national, regional, and local authorities is critical to implementing climate strategies. The framework has emphasized collaboration, policy alignment, and shared accountability as key drivers of effective climate action. Frascold said it has completed 90 years of operations. The Italy headquartered company operates in the refrigeration and air conditioning segment with a presence across multiple markets. The company said its operations have expanded over time in response to evolving industry requirements. It added that the sector continues to shift towards higher efficiency and sustainability standards. India's HVAC and digital infrastructure sectors are expanding rapidly. Organizers of ACREX India 2026 said in Mumbai. The event, which concluded on the 14th of March, brought together industry leaders and policymakers. According to the United News of India, the HVAC market in India is projected to reach $29.4 billion by 2030. At the same time, India's data center capacity has grown from 375 megawatts in 2020 to over 1,500 megawatts in 2025, according to the country's IT ministry. The growth reflects rising demand for digital infrastructure, cloud computing, and AI applications. Mostra Convegno Expocomfort concluded in Milan, Italy on the 27th of March. Organizers said the event brought together companies, professionals, and policymakers across HVAC, energy efficiency, renewables, and water systems. Across 4 days, the exhibition featured technical sessions, industry dialogues, and innovation showcases focused on hydrogen, alternative fuels, and sustainable systems. The event reinforced the sector's shift towards integrated energy solutions and cross-disciplinary collaboration, the organizers said. Saudi Arabia has announced plans for a major expansion into artificial intelligence. The country said it is preparing to invest up to $100 billion in Project Transcendence, The initiative includes large-scale data centers, advanced compute infrastructure, and AI ecosystems, Saudi Arabia said. At its core, a 1.5 gigawatt AI campus is planned, placing it among the largest compute facilities globally. The development underscores a critical reality. AI growth is directly tied to cooling infrastructure. In the United States, Princeton University said it is rethinking how campuses are heated and cooled. The university said it is deploying a large-scale system combining heat pumps and geo-exchange technology. The project includes more than 2,000 underground boreholes and extensive piping networks to store and redistribute thermal energy. The system acts as a thermal reservoir, supporting the university's goal of achieving climate neutrality. The global shift towards heat pumps is also reshaping the role of refrigerants. According to industry stakeholders, over time, the industry has transitioned from ozone-depleting substances to more climate-conscious alternatives. This evolution reflects a broader shift towards efficiency, safety, and environmental responsibility. Those were some of the developments that shaped the built environment this fortnight. From policy to technology, and from infrastructure to human impact, the industry is evolving on multiple fronts. And now, the Viewpoint segment. This week, we examine two critical areas that sit at the intersection of engineering, logistics, and human well-being. We begin with food safety and food security in the context of cold chain infrastructure. In today's global landscape, food systems are under pressure from geopolitical disruptions, supply chain constraints, and rising demand. And yet, countries across the GCC region in the Middle East are working to ensure that food availability remains stable and resilient. This is being achieved through strategic logistics, diversified sourcing, and strong regulatory frameworks. Cold chain infrastructure in particular plays a critical role in ensuring that food is transported, stored, and delivered safely. At the same time, this is not just a public service. It is also a business, one that must remain financially sustainable for long-term resilience. I earlier spoke to Bobby Krishna, Senior Specialist at the Food Safety Department of Dubai Municipality in the UAE, and to Brent Melvin, the General Manager of RSA Cold Chain, which is a joint venture of RSA Global and Americold. Bobby is a microbiologist by qualification, whereas Brent is a cold chain logistics specialist. Here are excerpts from the interview. Brent, you are a representative of a private sector end-to-end cold chain distribution hub. Could you comment on the stock in hand to ensure food security in the UAE and the broader GCC region?
Absolutely. So let me start off by talking about the general region is obviously been very focused on food safety for the longest time, knowing that we are sitting in a relatively volatile area, so not really immune to the potential of geopolitical fallout. And I've been here in this region for 21 years, and it has been the most amazing 21 years of safety and security. So this is an unprecedented situation, but typical to the region, they prepare, and more specifically UAE has prepared for this type of crisis. And I think a lot of this came about off the back end of COVID and other events where there's been panic and scare. And you'll note that the government's handled it in an incredibly positive way. So the first thing that happened is making sure food remains in the supermarket aisles. So there was no panic buying per se. The first day might have seen a little bit of a blip in that sense, but subsequently there's been continuity of products. You're not really seeing much dip in the way of brands or the availability of product on shelf. So that's testament to what is currently in the general supply at the moment. And then when you look at the country as a whole, We are covered for at least the next 3 to 6 months on general commodities and staples, even longer still. Now, that said, the whole thing about food safety is not necessarily what is only stored in country. And bearing in mind, you've got the private sector operators, of which we represent quite some brands who store with us on a 3PL basis. But you have the government that have their own policies and companies that would store and maintain food safety and security as a protocol. So actually the country is very well supplied. And further to that is not necessarily the amount of food in country, but it's the ability to start replenishing stock and how quickly can those supply chain channels be reinstated. And those would be key to the food security protocols overall. So, people immediately consider how much food is immediately available, but you need to look upstream of that. What comes through the supply chain, how quickly can they adapt to make sure those supply channels remain open or are reestablished? And then how quickly can that food start entering the market again so that you've got sustainability over long periods of time? So I think overall, the country has demonstrated exceptional resilience and ability to perform under what is a crisis period where everybody really practically just goes on business as usual. What a bizarre situation, but it's quite amazing.
So you're saying an ability to replenish, and that's a huge positive. That's a very strong framework that the country and the region has. But as an operator, as a 3PL operator, what challenges are you facing? And what are you doing to overcome them?
So the challenges for us would be twofold, and I'll speak very colloquially around, we're a revenue-driven operation. We provide services to companies who are distributors or retailers of food products. We see channels of product going into hotels, restaurants, and catering. We see product going into retail sectors. So my challenge is twofold. One is being able to get product flowing in so we can continue to get product flowing out, making sure that all of those channels receive products on time, every time, in the way that it should be received. So concerns for us will always be maintaining supply, maintaining traceability of product, because if you look at what has happened just now, a lot of shipping lines, of course, refuse to enter the Straits of Hormuz for obvious reasons, but they can't just simply float around the ocean with containers full of product. They have to do something with it. So we've had containers on sea that have been redirected through different channels. Sometimes there would be a vessel doing a end of journey call, and they offload all of the containers. So you've got containers that end up in ports that were completely undesignated. You then have to recover those containers, get them back either its origin, so you can deal with the product and move it through different channels, or get it redirected to ports that are being serviced into the UAE. So traceability is critical. Going hand in hand with that is the time on the vessel. We need to make sure the product doesn't sit in containers for overdue length of time, because that increases risk. Containers obviously are chilled or frozen, so that is maintained and managed, but you want to ensure that we get product through the actual transit process, transportation into a facility like ours where we can take control of it, and then it gets stored in a suitable environment, a managed environment where it's process driven, it's well chilled or frozen, so you've got sustainability of the product for its shelf life or expiry date management protocols. And then from there is just getting it out to customers. So the challenge for us right now is very little downstream to delivery. It's more upstream to supply. And that's where we're suffering right now.
Mm-hmm. You spoke on traceability, and I'm going to come to you, Bobby, on that. I need your views on that as well. But Brent, what cold chain intervention measures do you believe will ensure resilience?
We are automatically part of a very big food chain network. And I think that, you talk about resilience comes from policies driven by government. It comes from how companies plan and support their supply chains. So a typical thing that we've always done, and when I say we, I'm talking the logistics industry at large, is use the UAE as a hub for local consumption as well as re-export to our environment, which would be GCC or maybe neighboring countries. Depending on the company and the way that they do distribution is how they hold stock in country. So we try and provide two things. One is the ability to put stock in a forward stocking location to make sure you've got continuity. So you can imagine in this crisis, it's about who has stock in country is going to put stock on shelf, which is a sales potential, amongst other things. Now, when we're looking then at resilience, in order to build out those kind of requirements, you need to have exceptional facilities. These exceptional facilities are part of not only the physical processes, but equally the data processes that support them. So visibility of cargo, visibility of your expiry life cycles, sustainability of your cold chain to make sure that we're not seeing any kind of temperature excursions during the process of storage or logistics support. So those are key for us, and this goes hand in hand with what regulations exist around food safety. So UAE Federal Law number 10 of 2015 creates a legal framework for food safety. We operate within that governance, and we are audited according to those protocols and make sure that that's how we create a very strong cold chain network for our customers, and that helps create resilience in the food chain.
Bobby, would you like to comment on this, on cold chain intervention measures?
Yeah, Surinder, I think when you look at the cold chain and interventions, and we like to see the products in different categories, frozen versus chilled, and also fresh produce versus meat, poultry products. The biggest difference here is that when we look at fresh produce, there are limitations as to how long you can hold versus meat and poultry products, where if you are bringing in something chilled, you can make it frozen and extend the shelf life further, right? So the challenge is always associated with produce, and we also want people to eat healthy. No, it's just not like you get more proteins. There's a whole population that has vegetables and fruits as their core diet. So we looked at the different food supplies, did a risk assessment, and kind of looked at all the options to ensure that those products move faster and also separately. And we've seen that the controls that the industry has, as Brian was mentioning, especially with frozen chilled products, are pretty good because they are high value products, and they've always been on the best of conditions. And we also have a premium market for these products, so there's a lot of investments already in place. And when it comes to cold chain integrity, traceability tools are always available. Products, temperature monitoring, and also product monitoring records are always there. And our investments in digitalization since almost more than 2 decades has also helped us always, because you can trace back any products, you can find documents from anywhere, access them without any hassles. As long as there is power supply, we don't have a challenge, right? When it comes to fresh produce, it's a whole different supply chain. We've seen disruptions, and that's one reason why you saw waves in the supermarket, and that's largely because it cannot be stored. For instance, take the example of banana coming in from Ecuador. Large ships have to come into the ports. They may not be able to come in directly to Jebel Ali. They have to go to other ports in other countries, then take them off into smaller ships, then bring it to UAE's ports. And there is a particular shelf life that these products would have if there is a deviation in the temperature, right? It cannot be like frozen, or even a 2 degrees centigrade difference can enhance ripening of fruits and vegetables. So that's where the challenge is. So I think we've seen very good response. Retailers have really kept that in control. They've They've diversified the sources. So we've seen suddenly that we're not depending on one country. The businesses have gone for multiple options, and then supplies have been replenished. So the agility that you have comes from the experience of the traders and retailers, and that's very, very clearly visible. And as Brent rightly pointed out, during COVID, we have seen supply chain problems, and we also see ripple effects, right? So you see one set of problems, and that's in your first wave, which is suddenly shortage of supplies, and the second wave is very different, and there you see supplies getting steady, but number of products might go down, but consumers also got used to those products. And we also saw retailers having a very different demand right now. Hotels and tourists have gone down, so that consumption pattern has changed completely. I think choice of people also have changed. So the way we eat today is very different from how it was 1 month ago. So that food choice kind of also impacts, and it's like a two-way communication without saying. Like business and consumers are communicating by just showing by demand what are they buying more is what is getting supplied. So that's the second factor, and then you have the third wave, which are coming as impacts of supply chain disruptions in the countries that they produce, right? So you might have changes in energy is a major problem. So you look at Southeast Asia now, there will be impact. India is heavily impacted by the shortage of supply of LPG. So you can also see that affecting farms and input. We've also seen reduction in fertilizer production or supply, and that also will cost they increase the cost and lower the productivity in countries. So that wave is slightly different, and so we are prepared for all these things at different that can happen at different times, right? So, and communication is the key. So engaging the businesses as much as possible is what we're trying to do. So we know the problems, we know they're likely to happen, but how far and to what extent is what we don't know, and that's normally done through communication.
Okay, thanks. Brent, now that the region is seeing war clouds, are any efforts underway to increase cold storage capacity in the GCC region in terms of more pallets and basically more cold storage facilities?
I wouldn't say that the current geopolitical situation is a driver of cold store development. I think the region has had some years of new facilities coming on stream or additional capacity coming on stream. So, there tends to have been a market that in any event is growing. As a result, there is this continued investment in cold storage. And to your question, will this drive the additional requirement? I think that's hard to answer directly. What I will say is that in times like this, demand is scarce because a lot of people end up with two things happening. One is re-exporters are limited to the ability to re-export currently, and that's due to the availability of vessels or for the outbound export volumes. And that volume would have been sitting in port. It can't just sit in port for long periods of time. There are costs associated with that. So what happens is it then gets pulled back into facilities like ours. So storage becomes an absolute requirement. The other thing we're seeing, which is something similar to what happened during COVID, or in fact, actually more so what happened in the Red Sea crisis, is the redirection of vessels to longer sailing. So when vessels did come through, you get this concertina effect and suddenly a lot of port congestion going on. And when you get ports congestion being cleared, you get this big influx of containers happening all at once. So we're seeing a similar trend where exactly as Bobby was describing, mother vessels will call in Mundra or Navashiva. They'll offload a huge amount of volume in those ports, and then you've got feeder vessels bringing products into either Corfacam, Sohar, or in some cases Duqm. So you've got your green channel that's coming out of Oman, and you've got your clearance coming through Corfacam directly into country. Initially, as these ports arrangements were established, the flow was more idea and in principle workable. In practice, not so much. They had to iron out a few smaller details. You've seen huge queues of trucks waiting to collect containers in the port. The demand for gensets to move reefer containers and maintain cold chain has been unbelievable. So anybody who's sitting on a genset trailer at the moment is a prime supplier. But as these complexities are ironing out and the government is adjusting to the documentation processes, to the flow of goods, what you're seeing is suddenly this bigger release of volume. So my contract customers who traditionally would store with me would have had a steady inflow of containers throughout a period of time, because equally they'd be selling to market or reselling to different countries. So we'd see an inbound, outbound flow continuously. What we've seen for the last number of weeks is this outbound flow going obviously into local market consumption, but without the inbound. That's been the concertina. Now all of a sudden we're getting this massive release of containers hitting us all at once. So it's putting pressure on the supply chain and it's putting pressure on capacity. So myself, competitors in the market, people who are in the space will be not only managing their own customers, but the amount of new customers that are looking for space who typically wouldn't have used facilities like ours. So to your point now, yes, capacity is important. But what happens after this would be another story altogether. So touching on what Bobby mentioned about HVAC, so hotels, restaurants, are driven largely by tourism. Because tourism is going to be affected for the time being, the impact on consumption in local markets is naturally decreased. So I deal in about 200 tons of fresh produce every single day as a stock throughput. And Bobby's right, it's a different style of operations as opposed to your chilled or your freezer volumes. And because of that velocity, a lot of that goes into HVAC. We're seeing that being impeded somewhat as far as consumption, just simply because those channels are not consuming up that work. Dubai, UAE will bounce back. They'll do whatever promotions they do. They'll bring tourism back as quickly as possible, but it is a point in time. And this means that right now there's pressure on the cold chain, but it's not going to necessarily be sustainable because we will normalize. There is continued investment in the sector. There's continued enhancement in facilities. The issue you've got right now would be probably facilities that are not necessarily A grade will be full of product because they need to store it somewhere. That will be a concern, particularly for people like Bobby, because if those facilities are not suitable to maintaining product quality and integrity, what's the fallout from there? So that would be more my concern than what the current capacity is for modern facilities. There are many modern suppliers of really quality facilities in country already.
Okay. Bobby, you want to jump in on what Brent said?
Spot on there. So, and then kind of echoing on the food safety aspects here, it is always a challenge to look at the interim arrangements that are being made, because we don't even know where those arrangements are. So what happens if a supply is out of the port and there's a generator failure or a lack of cooling? Your product can look completely perfect, come to the port, and things are different from how it reaches the market. And I think that's exactly where we have to have that confidence on the importers that products will not be compromised, and if there is a deviation, they have to let us know, and then we look at what can you do with those products. Can reduction of shelf life or reprocessing, whatever we could do is what we'll try, and that's why these risk assessment processes are very important. So we've created different flow charts and process plans for decision making. So there's a decision tree for each of these scenarios that we've created, and that has been shared with the team, so we can quickly move on and take decisions. So what happens if frozen poultry comes in and it gets defrosted, or A great example is shell eggs. Currently, as Brent mentioned, there's a whole delay in reaching the ports, and by the time it reaches the port, it's close to the end of its shelf life. So what can you do with it? Can you process it quickly? Or repurpose it, so those kind of challenges would always be there. And then also we have to look at legislations. We've been traditionally, using best before and expiration dates interchangeably, whereas Europe and US best before dates would mean that you can use the product even after that time period is over. So we're also looking at flexibility in date marking, looking at shelf-stable products, perishable products, and trying to be agile with our legislation management. So there have been regulations which are set specifically for the interim period, which gives more flexibility. There's always a risk trade-off. You don't have those ideal conditions to protect public health to the level that you would want to. So by making the regulations slightly less stringent doesn't mean that you will have adverse. It's just that it increases slightly the probability of food going off, especially in this case, quality, not safety, with the best before date. So those are the kind of measures that we are focusing on at this moment.
Bobby, Brent spoke earlier on food traceability, and I read an article that you posted recently where you said that food traceability is not going to be easy when supply chain complexity increases. And I believe you said this in response to news reports on how large supermarket chains in the UAE are looking to freight food on boat and or road into the country's supply chain. Would you like to substantiate?
So there are two aspects here, sir. They're supermarkets might have better control most of the products that they would come in, provided the supply chain. I mean, it all depends on how the weakest link on the supply chain. Yeah? So most importers would have a good control, good visibility, especially if it's coming from Europe. There are certain trade routes, and documents have to go along with it, right? So you cannot forge a health certificate and get some products. But what happens is that when it comes to a manufacturing facility with which uses 50-60 different products to make an ice cream, it's difficult to know what came from where, with what ingredients, and so on, because they still need to carry that to the labels that they will use for manufacturing, right? So a retailer might be able to do that, but a manufacturer would have a challenge in identifying the products and their origins. And there also comes a vulnerability for food fraud, right? So you have traceability mechanisms strengthened mainly to reduce food fraud, in making sure that what we say is what we are giving, right? That's where the challenge is going to be, and this could be intentional or non-intentional, right? In some cases, intentional. And when we look at the past, and when Ukraine-Russia war started, there was a huge crisis with many food products. Wheat was down, eggs were down. Ukraine is one of the biggest suppliers of poultry products. And then for that, so when there is a deficit, other markets come and push in. So I'm not naming the countries, but there were products that came in from different countries with the Ukrainian label into the market, and those kind of frauds will happen. So there would be claims on origin. So origin fraud is a very common aspect, and this could happen to any product, right? There is a deficit where you cannot really identify. I mean, it's very hard for someone to judge the difference between an egg from a country versus big country, right? So then some products like Apple, you might be able to get it from taste or look or color, but not in poultry, especially like products like eggs. So that's where I was looking at the traceability, and it can also get really complex when it comes to certain ingredients, and the fraud increases. Like for instance, pistachios were really short, and Dubai chocolate fame increased the pressure on both pistachio and chocolate. And we can only anticipate those frauds to go up further, because there will be a further increase in demand, and not necessarily from the current market, but it also feeds into the supply chains later, because manufacturers don't produce food for this month. They are producing food for the next 2-3 years, right? So And then again, this is a category that I would deal with separately. Retailers will finish off by the time the product comes to the shelf, that's done. Whereas manufacturers have to get in products, produce it, and then put it to the shelf or dispatch it to other countries. And they have pressure on both sides, right? They have pressure on incoming and outgoing, and they need to make sure that the flow is on either side.
As a government representative, are you seeing a shift in any of the policies that have been in place for a while now? Any change in enforcement measures in response to the war situation, of course?
I think, an important aspect of legislation, especially in Dubai, is that, it's always built to absorb the pressures that would come in. So if you read the food code, it specifically says that there would be exceptional situations where you will have to use the risk logic and take decisions based on risk. And businesses are trained to understand risk and manage risk, and not to take absolute values as control measures. It's not the 5 degrees centigrade, it's 5 degrees centigrade for how long, and where and who is controlled. And emphasis has always been on management controls more than anything else. So legislations also allow better businesses to have more allowances and take better decisions with flexibility, whereas businesses that do not have a good compliance rating would have more or less flexibility in taking decisions. That's what we're continuing with. So even in today's context, that's what we are emphasizing with the team. Businesses that are complying better will get better benefits, and their labeling requirements have been made less stringent. English labeling versus Arabic labeling. So for instance, some products you may not have Arabic labels printed in because of the shortage in time to get to the market. So English label would be okay. Shelf life decisions, as I mentioned earlier, we are giving flexibility with shelf life, especially for frozen and dry goods. We're also giving documentation processes some allowance. So every product that comes into the country has to come with health certificates and documents which have to be given in. The originals have to be submitted. So now we're giving more allowance to get the original documents. Soft copies and messages would be enough to kind of release those. So there are allowances made, but that's not breach of requirements or change of requirement. It's just that there is a time. There's a bit of flexibility given on submission deadlines, so that businesses can they don't have to worry about the documentation per se.
Mm-hmm. So a bit of flexibility, a bit of agility on that, I suppose, right? And okay. Brent, yes, you want to jump in?
Just want to pick up on the whole expiry thing. So you've got the regulatory side of it, which Bobby has just described. But actually, interestingly enough, you have a consumer self-governance that takes place, which people wouldn't necessarily see. But if you look at retail outlets that we deliver to, they have what they refer to as a minimum shelf life requirement. So automatically, it doesn't matter if your product is still within a usable expiry period, it will not be received by certain retailers. And most of your mainstream high-end retailers have very strict shelf life requirements. So I'll pick up on something like meat, and meat comes into our country in one of two ways. It either comes in frozen or it comes in fresh. So just from a fresh perspective, there are limitations to your sailing period because you don't have the extended shelf life capabilities when it's fresh. So we would have situations where it'll arrive in port. It's getting near expiry. It doesn't mean to say it can't enter and it doesn't meet the regulatory requirements. But from a commercial standpoint, it won't move into the food chain for most retail sectors. So you get a lot of containers that get sold direct from port that are picked up by hotels. And again, depending on the hotel, catering, because it's cooked prior to an expiry date, but it can be closer to expiry. So we have an entire ecosystem that will touch the product at different stages of its life cycle. But from a commercial standpoint, there's a massive benefit by having delays on ocean. So, it doesn't necessarily only relate to regulatory import controls, but the actual consumer places its own controls around and self-governance around expiry of product.
Okay.
There is a value proposition also, sir, so a product might get frozen during the transit to enhance shelf life, right? So you can increase the shelf life of meat by freezing it instead of holding it chilled. So now the value changes because frozen meat is seen as less as you get less value in the market. So yes, that's the bargain that you would have. Normally someone is losing money because of that process, but then food is still safe. So the answer is that you might have food, but the concern would be at what cost is it coming in and who is losing, etc. And that's the trade-off that someone is going to make along the supply chain. So I think we have to also look at two different aspects here. One is the economic aspects of the war and conflict and how it impacts trade versus the food security aspect. And at some point of time, they're going to merge because lesser money would mean lesser investments. Now, imagine companies have to invest in generators, for instance, or buy machines and stuff like that. There's a cost that's going to go there. Producers have to put more money for fertilizer and for fuel. There's another set of costs. So that's the inflationary pressure that would set in. And that's what we have to be ready for now, which are things which will happen after 6 months or 1 year, and that brace ourselves with better policies for those decisions. And that's our future foresight plans and so on puts into, that's what we need to put into action.
So that was the interview I had with Bobby Krishna of Dubai Municipality and Brent Melvin of RSA Cold Chain. The second topic in the Viewpoint segment takes us to data centers. Modern digital infrastructure is evolving rapidly, but recent conflicts have exposed a critical vulnerability. Traditional data centers can be vulnerable to emerging threats, including low-cost aerial attacks. In response, engineering is evolving. Concepts such as fortress data centers are being developed, and they are designed to be resilient, high density, and mission critical. These facilities combine reinforced structures, advanced cooling, and protected infrastructure to ensure continuity. In other words, data centers are no longer just digital infrastructure. They are becoming strategic assets. I earlier spoke to George Berbari, the CEO of DC Pro Engineering and author of the critically acclaimed book, The Energy Budget. Here are excerpts from the interview. George, you're advocating the need for fortress data centers. Would you like to elaborate on this?
Yeah, sure. We had in the GCC in the recent incidents 2 data centers that were disrupted by drones attack. And I thought that these are mission critical data centers, should have the resilience and not be vulnerable to this low cost attack, especially to what they mean to the country and to the infrastructure as such. So probably we need to invest a little bit more in building and fortifying it, whether that's concrete or wire mesh on top, or and also look at the other aspect of it, such as the infrared footprint and the heat footprint of this, and efficiency and all that at once. We need to integrate a new design that shows these resiliency and improved efficiency and reliability.
Okay. And it's interesting, you're proposing that such data centers would employ a box-in-box vertical separation strategy to insulate critical IT assets from surface-level kinetic threats. How else would they differ from an MEP design point of view?
The main difference will be in architecture layout. Now, these racks are quite heavy and very, very expensive. They constitute 75% of the total cost of the data center. And these are very restricted from supply point. I mean, you need to be politically approved to receive these high-end racks. So you need to really protect them because if something happened to them, it's not easy to replace them. So these are your big asset. You are putting it in the most vulnerable space in the data center, the top floor with very little exposure. So we are removing these heavy assets. The rack weigh more than 3 tons. So why should you have a heavy concrete to hold it and light concrete to just shelter it? We are moving it underground, almost 10 meter, 11 meter underground. They are being built on very solid slab foundation, probably 1.2 meters thick of concrete that can carry big weight. And above it, there will be an attic that will house electrical, mechanical piping, and all that. And above that will be generator and chillers. And all these are in very solid concrete. On top of them, 3 meters above that, you will have another box of wire mesh that will intercept any drones and will take the first hit. And if an explosion happens, it will be away and the concrete can take it easily. From electromechanical point of view, I mean, right now we have very vulnerable air-cooled chiller and containerized generator sets, often in 1 millimeter thick steel, and the chillers are operating at 55, 60 degrees. So they have a big infrared footprint, and which all these drones can see, have infrared detectors. So when we move to cooling towers, I mean, almost it's below ambient, the fog. And these cooling tower now can be built from concrete cooling tower, not fiberglass. So they can take big hits, and that I think it's major difference from resilience and tackling all vulnerability points in the data center.
I see. And would such data centers not mean an escalation of capex? We all wish for geopolitical unrest to end. So how would you justify the capex for normal, long periods of peace and stability?
You know, if you take the data center building without populated racks, empty, the cost will be like 15-20% extra cost. But if you take that 75% of the cost are your racks, then your total cost increase will be 5%. Now that 5% against protecting such critical assets, I mean, I would say this will, I mean, be paid back if you avoid one day disruption.
Yeah,
One
sure.
day disruption in data center would cost much more than this.
So
Yeah, sure.
you're basically saying that from a cost-benefit analysis point of view, it makes sense to go for what you're characterizing as subterranean data centers, correct?
Correct.
I see.
In majority of it, you know, that cooling towers and some, I mean, will be exposed. So we are trying to protect it with another shield of wire mesh. So we are not protecting it against rocket attacks. We are protecting it against drones, which are more in numbers and much easier to send. Now, this is considering the GCC, but if I look at it globally, I mean, you could have terrorist attack with a homegrown drone sent to a data center. Again, this will protect against all these sabotage attempts, because right now, I mean, you cannot build a fence around the data center and put it in a remote area and say it is protected. This is what the recent incidents proves, that this is not sufficient.
And now, the commentary segment. This week, we turn our attention to a subject that is deeply scientific and carries a heavy emotional weight. In vitro fertilization, or IVF. When people think of IVF, they think of doctors, technology, and medical protocols. But there is another factor, one that is invisible yet critical: the air we breathe. Let me begin with a simple concept. In an IVF laboratory, embryos are grown outside the human body, which means their survival depends entirely on the environment around them. Arij Abu Farha, a clinical embryologist, says this environment must replicate the conditions of the human body with extreme precision. Temperature, humidity, pH levels, all tightly controlled. But there is one variable that is harder to manage: air quality. Now, why does this matter? Because embryos are among the most sensitive cellular structures in medicine, and they are highly vulnerable to airborne contaminants. Let me explain. IVF laboratories are exposed to volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. These come from building materials, cleaning agents, laboratory chemicals, even personal care products. Studies show that exposure to these compounds can trigger oxidative stress, damaging cells, fragmenting DNA, and impairing embryo development. Now, this is not just theory. James Webb, a molecular geneticist, says air pollution is a pervasive environmental determinant of health. Pollutants such as PM2.5, nitrogen oxides, ozone, and ultrafine particles have been linked to reduced fertility and poorer IVF outcomes. And here is what makes this significant. The most vulnerable stage of embryo development coincides with epigenetic reprogramming. This is when the embryo's genetic expression is being rewritten. Any disturbance during this stage can alter developmental outcomes. In other words, the environment around the embryo can influence how life develops at its earliest stage. Now let us go deeper. Nick Hagopian, president of ReviveAir, says in IVF, every particle matters because every embryo matters. Particulate matter, including PM2.5 and ultrafine particles, can carry toxins, microbes, and endocrine disrupting chemicals. When these settle on culture media or laboratory surfaces, they interfere with embryo development. Now, this brings us to engineering, because solving this problem is not just medical, it is environmental. Susanna Vidokovic, the Director of Business Development at Hollingsworth & Bose, says air filtration plays a critical role in IVF success. She explains that filtration systems must target particles, gases, VOCs, and microorganisms, and that multi-stage filtration systems with advanced filter media in IVF facilities can significantly improve embryo survival and treatment outcomes. Now let us step back. What does all this mean? It means that IVF laboratories are not just medical facilities, they are precision environments. And indoor environmental quality is not just a comfort parameter, it is a clinical variable. Let me say that again. Indoor environmental quality is a clinical variable. Because in IVF, the air is not just air, it is part of the treatment. And perhaps that is a bigger message. The environments we create are shaping outcomes in ways we are only beginning to understand. I will leave you with that thought, for that's all the time we have left in this episode. Thank you for watching.